Guys, look at him. Who wouldn't want to draw Ricky Leon? So we're starting out with a circle divided into fourths, and then the sides of his face are pretty broad so that they almost form vertical lines and they don't really taper in that much. His nose is between the horizontal line and his chin, and for now I just approximate it using 4 lines. Next, his whole mouth kind of sits above the midline between his nose and chin, and his upper lip sits on the midline between his lower lip and his nose. I draw his eyebrows in relation to his nose, so comparing these dotted lines on screen to see where his eyebrows start, and then using the angles of the solid lines to find where his eyebrows end. That also gives me more information about the width of his face because it's not much farther than the end of his eyebrow. For nostrils, I draw little curves in the lines from earlier, and then his shadow for his nose is pretty vertical with a little divot where his eye is, so I draw that. The other shadow kind of makes a C shape and it comes down a little bit halfway between his eyebrow and nose. It also curves in a little past his nostril. For nose shading, his nose is kind of like a ball and light is coming from the top, so I shade the bottom. Oof, okay, so eyes are pretty difficult for me to place accurately sometimes, but this time I got lucky, so I look at where the eyes start in relation to his nose, and then keep the ends of the eyes within the slopes that we drew earlier to find his eyebrows, and then vertically his eyes fall kind of in the middle of the C-shaped shadow that we drew. And then he has double eyelids that follow pretty closely to his eye shape, but they're still pretty flat. In general, I try to keep his eye shape pretty flat, where the tops of the eyes are not much higher than the corners of his eyes. And then here I'm drawing in the shadow that kind of sits directly on top of his double eyelid and connects his eyebrow with the shadow on the side of his nose. Alright, next step, pupils. So for pupils, I kind of look where they are in relation to the sides of his nose and also the sides of his mouth. So as you can see here, one of them is a bit closer to the side of his nose and the other one is a bit farther. And then you can also do the same thing with the sides of his irises. And then his eye bags are pretty thick. They kind of line up with the bottom of the C-shaped shadow, and then I do some smaller shading. Alright guys, so we are finished with what I think is the hardest part of drawing faces, and now moving on to the hair. So it starts in the upper quadrant of that circle that we drew and then connects to the end of his eyebrow that we drew earlier, and then follows the shape of his head and comes off that initial circle that we drew a little bit. So his hair is only as long as the bottom of his eye bags, but if you want to draw emo Leon, that would also be fun to see. And just make sure, at least in this reference, to keep the sides of his bangs touching the ends of his eyebrows on both sides. And then his ear starts slightly above his eyebrow and then ends in the midpoint between his nose and eyebrow. And then continuing to thicken and refine his nose shadows a bit. So at this point, once I think I've got the locations of his features locked down, I start darkening things, adding some light shading, emphasizing certain lines. Also, side note, for these tutorials, I've been thinking about doing videos where I provide feedback on your guys' art if you followed it and you're struggling, so let me know if you guys would be interested in that. And then his cheekbone shadow follows a pretty nice curve to the end of his mouth, and I like to kind of find the slope of the shadow by looking at the shape of the light space on his cheeks. And then to draw his mouth, I start out by drawing his upper lip and then the shadow under his entire mouth, which helps me determine the length of his chin and then also the shape of his jaw. Mouth position I find by comparing with the sides of his nostrils, and then the shape of his jaw I look at by kind of seeing where the hinge of his jaw lies, if that makes sense. And then looking at the curvature of his jaw. And then his top lip is kind of just a straight, thick line, with a little divot for his cupid's bow. And then his bottom lip is very U-shaped and connects to the corners of his upper lip. Shading in the whites of his eyes a little because they're not purely white. And then to draw his neck, I use the side of his face as a reference point, and then also his pupil. Basically, I just try to find things that I can line up his neck with to get it in the right location. For his shoulders, I'm seeing that they're almost the same level as the bottom of his chin, and then his collar starts a little bit above his mouth, almost on the same level as the bottom of his nose. At this point, I'm kind of sketching out the finer details, like shading in his eye, erasing the front part of his tear duct to keep the shape pretty flat still, and then also drawing out tiny details like his double eyelid. And then here, I'm erasing the under eyes a little because they were a little bit too dark. And now this is the part where I feel like it really starts to come together and starting to fill in the more medium shadows and just in general lightly shading his entire face. But we see that his cheekbone shadow kind of extends vertically, and then also refining the shape of his upper lip to have more of an M shape as it kind of tapers down to meet his bottom lip. His eyelashes are one of the darkest parts on his face, so I'm really accentuating these and trying to make them stand out. At this point, I'm basically just in the stage of accentuating certain shadows or adding shading to parts of his face, not really making proportion adjustments at this time. So I'll try to point out what I'm looking at as I'm drawing the shadows on the reference. Here he has a slightly darker cheekbone shadow that goes towards his mouth, and then the rest of his cheek is a little bit darker than some of the brighter areas on his face, as well as the middle bottom part of his chin. For the hair, RE2 Remake Leon's hair is actually pretty dark, so I start off just by lightly shading it all one shade, just making sure to follow the direction of the hair strands at this point. And now shading over again the darker parts of his hair. For this drawing, the darkest parts are near the part in his hair and also the ends of his bangs, and it kind of forms a gradient towards the highlight that we see in his hair. And then after doing the basic shading, I go in with my mechanical pencil just because it has the capacity to shade a little darker than the other pencil I used. And then I was adjusting the height of his hair because I felt like there were parts that had different slopes in my drawing than the reference. But I feel like this was optional. You could leave him with more hair. And then for the outfit on this one, I feel like the way I drew it, it looks like he's just wearing a sweater over a collared shirt like a grandpa. Not exactly a police uniform, but you know, it's kind of cute. So I line up his collar with the side of his jaw, and then for his trachea, I guess, I line that up with his mouth, and then his Adam's apple I draw with a V shape, with one leg of the V coming off of the side of his windpipe. For the shading, it's pretty much smooth shading to the right of his windpipe, but make sure to keep the bottom of the V pretty light, and then just making the collar around his neck pretty dark for contrast. At least that's what I like to do. If you guys made it this far, congrats! Feel free to let me know how the drawing went for you in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.